Hi quilters! Today's video covers the Henhouse quilt by Claire Turpin. I have my notes out today because I'm going to go over the introduction of how I did this quilt. The pattern itself covers hand applique, so it can be done without a machine. The directions also include using a brother scan and cut. I like this idea because the brother scan and cut generates both a cut pattern that can be used on the scan and cut, and it also generates a pattern, a digital design that can be used on your embroidery machine. I think this is an excellent idea and a great time saver. However, I don't have a brother scan and cut, so I decided to riff on this idea a little bit. So I decided it would further speed up the process for me if I went ahead and created a digital file. I had been following along with some of Becky Thompson from Power Tools with Threads videos, and she was demonstrating how to use a scan and cut to create the digital files. I thought that was a great idea, and I decided that I wanted digital files, although what the scan and cut would give you is it would also generate the cut files that would exactly match up to the digital files on your sewing machine. What this means is that you could drop your cut pieces onto your applique project as you're working on it after you put out your trace stitches. The normal way to do this would be to stop and cut. After you've floated your fabric in the hoop, you would stop and cut. And so what this gives you is a lot of time because all of your pieces would be pre-cut by the scan and cut. So since I don't have this, but it would be a great thing to have, and if you do, this is the way that you should use it. So as I was working this pattern, it took me about 2 weeks to do the quilt behind me. I think that if I was using the scan and cut, it probably could have knocked it down to about 1 week. Now what I'm not including on that 2 weeks is all my fabric choices and pre-cutting out my blocks before I began this project. So there was probably a day or two cutting out fabric for this. So there's a lot of other changes I've made. One is the size and the placement of the blocks. I wanted a bigger quilt than the pattern called for. And what this meant is that I just decided to enlarge the size of my blocks. I cut my blocks to 13 inches. The reason I cut my blocks to 13 inches is so that they would fit within my hoop and my hoop would snap down over them. I use a 360 by 200 hoop. I use cutaway stabilizer and I cut most of it out just around, being very careful not to cut away my stitches. So that's one of the things that has to do with machine applique. The reason I did this is because I wanted it to look and feel like fabric. So with all the extra stabilizer, it just made it too stiff to make a poofy quilt. I wanted to use the specific pattern that was shown on the pattern booklet in the order that it was. So that was one thing that I wanted to keep the same. However, I wanted to also follow the block placement pattern that I had decided on. So how I did this was I laid my blocks that I'd already cut out on the floor, and I just stood at the top of the stairs, kind of like I'm doing now, and I looked down, and when I got a block placement pattern that I liked, then I took a picture of it and I made a PowerPoint for that. So I overlaid the little chickens that I had over the block placement, and those were the two things that I wanted to keep in mind throughout this project. So I used a PowerPoint slide to track the block placement. You could also just cut out the designs that are on the front of your pattern, or you could scan those first so you keep your pattern together if you're interested. But that way you have little cartoons that you can follow as you go along. The second set of cartoons I scanned these out and I cut them up, was so that I could pin them to my individual designs as I was working through my stacks. I also just hand wrote little sheets of paper about the rows that I was doing. So row 1, row 2, row 3, row 4, row 5, row 6. That kept me tracking where everything is within the stacks. This was a very doable project. Check out my other videos on the Henhouse and on other quilting and embroidery projects. Don't forget to like and subscribe to get my latest quilting and embroidery film clips.